I killed something that night. I'm a long-haul truck driver. I've been doing it for almost 15 years, and I've honestly enjoyed it. I've hauled everything from dried goods like cereal and macaroni to things like cell phones and computers. It's been a pretty well-paying career, and I've found satisfaction in the solitude and the steady rhythm of the road. However, there was one night about 10 years ago that still haunts me. That night, I was hauling office supplies such as pens and paper halfway across the country. I'd been driving for a pretty long time, but I had a deadline to beat, and the highway stretched out before me like a black ribbon through the night. I remember it was getting pretty late, but my favorite podcast was keeping me company. I guess listening to guys argue about sports made me feel a little less lonesome. The road has a way of doing that sometimes, making you feel like you're the only person in the world. Luckily, I had a beautiful fiancée waiting for me at home, her picture hanging from the sun visor as a constant reminder of what I was working for. But on that night, she would be the furthest thing from my mind. I remember cruising down a dark and desolate highway, with no other cars in sight. The road was lined with thick trees, their branches casting eerie shadows that danced in the headlights. There were no stores, no houses, not even the faintest glow of a distant town. Just me, the road, and the night. In moments like that, it felt as if the entire world had disappeared, leaving me alone in an endless void. But I was about to be proven very wrong. As I stared into the blackness ahead, the road remained clear and empty. Suddenly, something darted in front of my truck from out of nowhere, like a shadow materializing from the dark. My heart leaped into my throat as I instinctively hit the brakes, but I knew it was futile. With such a big machine, there was no way to stop in time. The impact was immediate and jarring, the entire 18-wheeler shuddering violently as I collided with whatever had crossed my path. It must have been big because it felt like I had hit a wall. I came to a stop as quickly as I could, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, fearing the worst. My mind raced with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. Had I just hit a person? The thought sent a chill down my spine. The idea of ending someone's life, of destroying their future and mine in one tragic instant, was too much to bear. Getting married, having a few kids, and watching them grow, those things wouldn't happen with me sitting in a prison cell. But regardless of my fear, I knew I had to check on whatever, or whoever, I had hit. Though deep down, I doubted anything could have survived a head-on collision with a semi-truck. I hesitated before stepping out of the cab, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked around to the front of the truck, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Within my first few steps, I heard a small squelching sound beneath my feet. I looked down and saw a pool of blood already beginning to spread across the asphalt. My stomach turned as I realized that my size 10 boot was already standing in it. That's when the horror truly set in. This had to be a human. No animal would lose this amount of blood. The sheer volume was hard to fathom. But I was positive that I had just killed someone. But within a few more steps, I would be proven wrong. Pinned under the front of my truck, lying twisted and broken, was not the body of a human being. Instead, it was something else, something I couldn't immediately comprehend. The creature looked like it had come straight out of a nightmare. I could see that it was dead, its body limp and motionless, but as for what it was, I couldn't tell you. The thing was massive, easily 6 feet tall, with a hulking frame that seemed too large for any animal I'd ever seen. Its fur was matted and dark, almost black, covering its broad chest and shoulders. The head was the most disturbing part, like that of a canine, but with features that seemed almost human. Fangs protruded from its mouth, long and sharp, and its eyes, what was left of them, seemed to glare at me even in death. I stared at it, my mind reeling as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It could have been a large dog, but that didn't seem right. There was something too unnatural about it, something too grotesque. Even though it was trapped under my truck, I could clearly see its broad chest and shoulders, as well as 2 long and hairy legs, almost like a man's. The only thing I could compare it to was the werewolves I'd seen in horror movies, but this wasn't a movie. This was real, and it was lying dead beneath my truck. Absolutely stumped and unsure of what to do, I called the police. My hands shook as I dialed the number, my voice barely steady enough to explain the situation. While waiting for them to arrive, I couldn't help but stare at the creature, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. I'd never seen anything like it before, and the more I looked, the more unsettling it became. A putrid smell began to emanate from its corpse, a stench so foul it made my eyes water. It smelled like something rotten, like an animal that had never bathed, combined with the metallic tang of blood. I'd be so glad when the officers finally arrived. Maybe they could make some sense of the situation. Maybe they could tell me that it was just some animal, something explainable, something that wouldn't haunt my nightmares. When the police did arrive, I was greeted by 2 older men who gave me annoyed looks as they stepped out of their cruiser. I could tell they were tired, probably at the end of a long shift, and the last thing they wanted to deal with was a dead animal on the highway. But those thoughts would change as soon as they saw this thing. Both men's eyes grew wide, their expressions shifting from annoyance to shock. Their skin turned pale under the harsh headlights, and I heard one whisper to the other, asking if this could be some guy in a costume. They approached the creature cautiously, as if it might suddenly spring back to life, and I watched as they tried to pull it out from under my truck. As they did, the smell became even worse, a nauseating combination of rot and decay that made me gag. But it wasn't just the smell that was overwhelming, it was the sheer size of the thing. Seeing its entire body for the first time left us all in awe. It was so big, its limbs thick and muscular, its claws sharp and menacing. The arms alone were thicker than some bodybuilders, and I had no doubt that those claws could have ripped us apart with ease if it were still alive. I'll never forget the look on one of the officers' faces as he spoke into his walkie-talkie, his voice trembling with unease. He then approached me and shook his head before speaking. "Mister, we don't know what you hit, but we're gonna need somebody smarter than us to figure it out. Mind waiting by the car?" he asked. Now, I did have a load to deliver, and I was already behind schedule, but it seemed best to comply. If I was being honest, I was just as eager to figure out what was lying there as they were. Whatever this thing was, it was beyond anything I had ever encountered, and I had a sinking feeling that I wasn't going to like the answers. After another 20 minutes passed, a second vehicle arrived on the scene. But it wasn't another police cruiser. Instead, it was a mysterious all-black car, the kind that immediately sets off alarm bells in your mind. The man who stepped out was just as unsettling. He was dressed in a sharp black suit that matched the car, his demeanor calm and composed, but there was something about him that made my skin crawl. He had an air of authority, but not the kind that comes from a badge or a uniform. No, this man had the kind of authority that came from something much darker. He glanced at the creature for only a brief moment before letting out a loud sigh, as if he had seen this sort of thing before, and it was just another inconvenience in his night. Without saying a word, he began to approach me. I'd be lying if I said the man wasn't intimidating. Something about the look in his eyes was cold and calculating, like he had walked through hell and come back unscathed. There was no empathy in those eyes, no concern, just a quiet, ruthless efficiency. I remember he looked at me and spoke in a deep, gravelly voice. "They've got a lot of cleanup to do here. Let's go to the station and talk about what you saw." Once again, I didn't resist. I willingly went along with this strange man, too shocked and too scared to do otherwise. He drove me to a nearby police station, where I was seated in a cold, sterile interrogation room. I was alone at first, the silence pressing down on me like a weight, but soon the man would return, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He looked down while stirring his coffee, his movements slow and deliberate, before he began talking. He told me that what I saw tonight was nothing more than an exotic pet, an endangered species that was actually very illegal to own. He explained that some wealthy and reckless individuals smuggled these creatures into the country as status symbols, flaunting them at secret gatherings. I couldn't help but giggle at the absurdity of it all. I didn't believe what he said for a second. The thing I hit was no pet, and I told him as much. I mentioned that it looked more like a werewolf to me, half expecting him to laugh along with me. But he wasn't amused. Instead, he slammed his hand on the table, his eyes narrowing with anger as he shouted at me. He told me that there was no such thing as a werewolf, that I needed to realize that this wasn't a game. His voice was harsh and demanding, and he pushed the story of the exotic pet, insisting that I agree with him. He made it clear that this wasn't a request, it was an order. He even went so far as to suggest that I could lose my job if I didn't comply, that there would be consequences if I didn't play along. Faced with the threat of losing everything I had worked for, I had no choice but to assure him that what I hit was only a pet. I repeated the lie back to him, hoping that it would satisfy him. Afterwards, he asked for my shoes, his tone cold and dismissive. I watched as he took them away, leaving me in my socks, before returning a few minutes later with a pair of cheap jailhouse shoes. He told me that mine were ruined by the blood and that he had thrown them out. I was pretty upset, as those were an expensive pair of work boots, but it was obvious that I had no room to negotiate. I was at this man's mercy, and he knew it. He didn't let me finish my shipment either, claiming that my truck was totaled out. I knew this was a lie. The front end was only lightly damaged, nothing that would have prevented me from driving. But again, I had no choice but to accept his story. He handed me a bus ticket and sent me back home, my mind spinning with confusion and fear. I was off the road for 2 weeks without hearing a thing, my thoughts consumed by that night and the creature I had killed. Finally, my boss called and put me back to work. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after something like that. Weeks turned into months, and then years. My fiancée and I got married, and we even had a little boy. I continued to drive 18-wheelers, never having another incident like that again. But while my life seemed mostly normal on the surface, there were still moments that reminded me of that night, moments that made me question whether I was truly free from what had happened. I'd receive phone calls in the middle of the night, strange voices asking if I'd seen anything unusual or strange. I would say no, trying to identify the caller, but they always hung up before I could ask any questions. At times, I would catch suspicious black vehicles following my rig while I was driving, their presence unsettling and ominous. Perhaps it was all just a coincidence, and I prayed that it was. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone, or something, was keeping tabs on me. I still don't believe what I hit that night was just a pet. There was something more to it, something that defied explanation. As for its true identity, I'm sure it will forever remain a secret, buried along with whatever files that strange man had in his possession. And if I'm being honest, maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left unknown, and some nightmares are better left in the dark.